The morning mist clung stubbornly to the edges of Maple Hollow, curling around the gnarled trunks of ancient apple trees as if reluctant to reveal the world beneath them. It was in one such orchard that the first discovery sent a ripple of unease through the sleepy village. A body lay sprawled beneath the largest apple tree, its trunk twisted like a giant's limb, branches laden with crimson fruit that dripped dew like miniature lanterns. The corpse was of a man in his 40s, known to the villagers but not intimately, Mr. Harold Tyndall, a quiet accountant who lived at the edge of town, unremarkable in every way except for the steady diligence with which he tended his modest life. Yet now, sprawled in the damp grass with an expression of stunned surprise frozen on his face, he was anything but ordinary. The scene itself defied explanation. There were no signs of struggle. His coat was intact, buttons fastened, hands clean. The pockets held his wallet, keys, and a handkerchief monogrammed with his initials. The absence of forced entry or theft suggested neither robbery nor personal vendetta. But the most confounding detail, the one that sent the constable into a perplexed daze, was the strange arrangement of objects around him. A single apple had been placed delicately on his chest, its skin glistening, unblemished, almost ceremonial. Scattered nearby were fragments of a broken teacup, painted with delicate floral patterns, though there was no house or picnic site in sight. And under his left shoe, partially hidden by fallen leaves, lay a folded scrap of paper with only a single word scrawled in an unfamiliar hand: "Listen." By mid-morning, news of the discovery had reached Miss Jane Marple, who had been tending her herb garden in a quiet corner of the village. She was known for her keen observational skills and her uncanny ability to untangle human motives that seemed hopelessly knotted. As she walked the short path to the orchard, her eyes absorbed every detail: the angle of the body, the way the grass pressed into his coat, the subtle indentations in the soil that suggested movement before collapse. The orchard was a puzzle, and she had long been convinced that even the smallest detail, no matter how inconsequential it appeared, held significance. The local constable, a stout man with more enthusiasm than experience, had already begun interrogating neighbours. Everyone had seen Harold the day before, carrying his briefcase along the cobblestone lane as usual, exchanging nods with the baker and the postman. No one had reported unusual visitors, arguments, or quarrels, and yet the sequence of events leading to his death remained shrouded in mystery. Miss Marple crouched beside the body, noting the faint traces of soil on the soles of his shoes, the way his coat pocket bulged slightly. She lifted the folded scrap of paper delicately with her gloved fingers, examining the handwriting. It was sharp, almost hurried, but not aggressive, a hand more accustomed to letters than threats. "Listen," it read, simple and yet unsettling. What was he meant to hear, or perhaps what had he already heard? As she walked the perimeter of the orchard, Miss Marple's mind wove connections where none seemed obvious. The apple tree itself, gnarled and ancient, had roots that crept under the ground like silent witnesses. The placement of the teacup fragments suggested it had been carried deliberately, not fallen accidentally. Who would arrange such a scene, and why? There were no footprints leading to the tree from nearby houses, nor away from it, except Harold's own. The surrounding air smelled faintly of earth and damp wood, yet carried no traces of smoke, no lingering scent of poison, nothing overt to mark a struggle. It was the perfect enigma, simple enough to seem an accident, yet precise enough to hint at intention. By afternoon, villagers had gathered at the edge of the orchard, their murmurs filled with speculation. One suggested a wandering madman, another a supernatural curse, and yet another a long-forgotten grudge resurfacing in grisly form. Miss Marple remained silent, observing not the spectacle of fear but the human behaviours that accompanied. A woman brushing dirt from her skirts nervously, a man gesturing animatedly to emphasize theories, a child crouched in the grass, staring at the apple as though it held the secrets of the universe. Each detail mattered. Each reaction was a thread in the tapestry of motive, deception, and hidden knowledge. When the constable finally approached her, exasperated and slightly impatient, Miss Marple only smiled. "It is never the obvious path that leads to truth," she said softly. Her gaze returned to the folded note, the broken teacup, and the solitary apple resting on the chest of the deceased. The crime was at once too simple to be credible and too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had choreographed this moment, chosen each element with intention, and Miss Marple had already begun to listen to the whispers of the orchard, to the silent confessions of human nature, and to the secret rhythm of events that had led Harold Tyndall beneath that apple tree. The mystery, she knew, was unsolvable only to those who overlooked the subtle signs. And in that orchard, amid the morning mist and fallen leaves, Miss Marple understood that the smallest clue, the tiniest gesture, might yet reveal everything. The question was not who had killed Harold Tyndall, it was why, and how a simple orchard could become the stage for a meticulously orchestrated enigma that challenged logic itself. Miss Marple lingered near the base of the apple tree long after the villagers had begun to drift back to their routines, her sharp eyes tracing patterns invisible to most. The constable busied himself with official duties, cordoning off the orchard, photographing the scene, and collecting the few items deemed relevant. He treated the broken teacup as a mere curiosity, and the note as a cryptic aside, yet Miss Marple already sensed their importance. The way the fragments were positioned, one under Harold's sleeve, another by his hand, spoke of deliberate placement rather than random chance. Someone had staged this scene with care, almost ritualistic precision, and that suggested knowledge beyond the ordinary. Her attention shifted to a small object partially obscured by a cluster of leaves near the edge of the clearing. It was a hairpin, delicate and polished, with a tiny ornamental bead at its tip. To most it would appear insignificant, a dropped item perhaps overlooked by the wind, but Miss Marple noted its orientation. The tip pointed almost like a directional arrow toward the apple tree, as though intentionally left for someone to find. She picked it up and held it against the light, considering how few women in the village had the patience for such an exacting touch, and how many of them were familiar enough with Harold to arrange this scene without arousing suspicion. Her musings were interrupted by the approach of a young constable, notebook in hand, face flushed from the morning chill. "Miss Marple," he said with a mixture of respect and exasperation, "I suppose you want to know about the forensics?" The man rattled off the routine. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood beyond a faint scrape on the back of Harold's head, and the coroner had been called to examine the body. "Everything is straightforward," he concluded, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed a lingering uncertainty. Miss Marple smiled gently, concealing the keen curiosity that had already identified more than the official investigation had revealed. "Straightforward, yes," she murmured, "if one ignores the details. But the devil," she added softly, "has a habit of hiding in plain sight." Her eyes, now moving toward the nearby hedgerows, caught the subtle impression of footprints leading away from the orchard, shallow but deliberate, almost masked by leaves. They were not Harold's, nor were they freshly made by someone escaping the scene in haste. Whoever had left them had moved carefully, as though performing a choreographed routine rather than fleeing from a crime. Miss Marple's next observation came from an entirely different source: human behavior. A group of villagers had gathered a few yards away, pretending to inspect the fallen fruit. Yet Miss Marple noted the woman among them, whose hands twitched nervously, brushing imaginary dirt from her skirt every few seconds. Her eyes, wide and too alert, darted to the tree, then to Harold, then toward the road as though calculating an escape route. Miss Marple recognized that kind of attention. It was the subtle tremor of guilt, not fear. And if guilt could be observed in such a small gesture, it meant the motive was close, almost within reach. Curiosity piqued. She wandered closer to the village path, where a cart had been parked the night before. Beneath its shadow lay a half-hidden bundle of cloth, faded, ordinary at first glance, yet Miss Marple immediately saw it was a jacket too small for any adult male, its cuffs frayed and faintly stained. She carefully lifted it, noting a strong scent of apple blossoms, strangely reminiscent of the orchard, yet carried here from elsewhere. A misplaced jacket, a stray hairpin, a single cryptic word on a scrap of paper. Each element was a piece of a puzzle whose edges did not yet align. Her examination was interrupted by a voice, thin and uncertain, belonging to one of the villagers who had lingered too long. "Miss Marple, I thought I saw something, or someone, last night," the man stammered, avoiding her gaze. His hands fidgeted, the skin on his knuckles pale. Miss Marple tilted her head, allowing him a moment to speak freely. "A shadow near the orchard," he said finally, "just after sunset. I thought it was a fox, or maybe a wandering traveller." His hesitation, the way his eyes shifted to the tree and then back to her, told her more than the words themselves. People who lie tend to overcompensate, embellishing the mundane to hide the extraordinary. By late afternoon, the orchard had grown quieter, the sun dipping behind low clouds, casting long, restless shadows among the apple trees. Miss Marple stood near the body, surveying the scene one last time before leaving, her mind tracing the movements of that shadow, the direction of footprints, the slight misplacement of everyday objects. She understood that Harold Tyndall had not stumbled into his fate by accident. The scene had been orchestrated, and someone had been watching, waiting, ensuring that every detail served a purpose. The first signs of deception, subtle but undeniable, had already emerged. The hairpin, the errant jacket, the suspicious gaze of the villager. The crime, deceptively simple at first glance, was revealing its complexity in fragments. Miss Marple knew she had to follow each clue carefully, connecting the human threads with the physical ones, listening to the whispers of guilt and intent before the full picture could emerge. And somewhere, perhaps in the shadows of the orchard or in the quiet corners of the village, the person who had arranged this mysterious tableau waited, confident that no one could see what they had so carefully concealed. Miss Marple, however, was already seeing. By early evening, the village hall had been converted into a makeshift interview room. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the polished wooden table, but shadows clung stubbornly to the corners of the room, where nervous villagers gathered, shuffled, and waited. Miss Marple settled into a chair opposite the constable, who looked uneasy in his own formal clothes, muttering about procedure and timetables. She did not need timetables. She needed voices, movements, and the faintest ticks that revealed the truths people tried to conceal. The first witness called was the baker, a stout man with flour-dusted hands and a habitual twitch in his left eye. "I saw Harold yesterday," he said, brushing crumbs from his apron. "He came in for bread, yes, and he seemed nothing unusual, really, just normal Harold." He smiled too fixedly. Miss Marple noticed how he avoided her gaze when mentioning the orchard, how his hand drifted repeatedly to the edge of the table. Normal, she thought. Yet normal can mask unease. She let him ramble, noting the small contradiction. He remembered Harold's visit to the bakery perfectly, yet could not recall the time, a detail someone usually remembered if the timing were mundane. Next came the postman, a wiry fellow whose cap sat crooked atop his head. "I passed by Harold's house yesterday afternoon," he said, "and saw nothing out of the ordinary. Windows shut, lights on. Mr. Tyndall appeared to be writing something perhaps, or reading letters. I didn't look too closely." His eyes darted to the ceiling as he spoke, then quickly back to Miss Marple. The detective observed his slight hesitation, the way he emphasized uncertainty, classic evasive language. When she asked whether he had noticed anyone near the orchard, he shook his head violently, almost too emphatically. Such denials often hide more than they reveal. A third villager, the woman Miss Marple had noticed in the orchard, was led in. She was thin, sharp-featured, and her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. I don't know much," she began, voice quivering. I was just passing by, and I heard something strange, perhaps a scream, or maybe it was the wind." Her story wavered as she spoke, filling the gaps with uncertainty, yet the tremor in her voice suggested a deeper anxiety. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The apple tree, the note, the staged objects. It was unlikely that someone involved would speak so hesitantly if entirely innocent. And yet, the inconsistency between her fear and her insistence on distance raised suspicion. One by one, the villagers recounted their version of events. Some were overly eager, volunteering details that seemed rehearsed, while others withheld information, pausing as if the wrong words might betray them. A pattern began to emerge. The simplest accounts carried subtle contradictions, and each contradiction hinted at knowledge beyond what a casual observer might possess. The constable jotted furiously, but it was Miss Marple who connected the invisible dots, the way a shadow on the wall could suggest the presence of an object, or a flicker in a witness's gaze could reveal a lie. A gardener, called in because of his proximity to the orchard, confessed seeing a figure at dusk near the edge of the trees. "I couldn't make out much," she said. "Tall, thin, moved quickly. Disappeared before I could call out. When pressed, he hesitated, then added, 'But they carried something.'" Miss Marple leaned forward, noting the significance, the figure's rapid movement, the carrying of an object, the deliberate avoidance of detection. These small details aligned with her earlier observation of footprints and the subtle arrangement of the teacup fragments. Even the constable's notes could not capture what Miss Marple observed in the pauses, the micro-gestures, the fleeting looks exchanged among witnesses, a small, careful tap of the fingers, a glance toward the door, a subtle shift in posture. Each indicated who had rehearsed their story and who spoke spontaneously. One man, the local grocer, insisted he had been home the entire afternoon, yet his jacket bore traces of orchard soil, faint but undeniable. Another, a neighbour who claimed to have seen nothing, flinched when Harold's name was mentioned, betraying a hidden familiarity. By the time the last villager left, the room hummed with quiet tension. Miss Marple remained seated, eyes scanning the empty chairs as if the silence itself contained answers. She thought of the word on the scrap of paper, listen. It was not a command directed at Harold alone, but at anyone willing to pay attention, willing to hear what others overlooked. The voices she had heard tonight were layered, deceptive, each concealing and revealing in equal measure. One narrative overlapped another. Small contradictions hinted at a secret choreography behind the seemingly random events of the orchard. Miss Marple rose, folding her hands as she considered the tangled threads. The deception was no longer subtle. It had become a pattern. Someone had orchestrated Harold's death with precision, and the witnesses' statements were fragments of a carefully constructed illusion designed to mislead. Yet, with careful listening and patient observation, the facade began to crack. The orchard, the teacup, the misplaced jacket, the hairpin, and now these voices, all pointed toward a truth hidden in plain sight, a truth that only someone attuned to the faintest cues could uncover. And Miss Marple, quietly resolute, knew she had begun to hear it. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to the village with a quiet determination, carrying a notebook already filled with observations, sketches of footprints, and the subtle alignments of the orchard scene. The mist clung stubbornly to the cobblestone lanes as she made her way from house to house, speaking with those whose lives intersected with Harold Tyndall. It quickly became clear that nearly every person she encountered had a motive, a subtle reason that could explain his death, yet none could account fully for the precise orchestration of the crime. Mrs. Enderby, the wealthy widow who lived 2 doors down from Harold, had recently quarrelled with him over the rights to a parcel of land adjoining the orchard. The argument had grown heated, witnessed by the baker and several other neighbours. Yet Mrs. Enderby, when Miss Marple questioned her, spoke with a careful tone, emphasising reconciliation and concern for the village rather than hostility. Her eyes, however, flickered to the orchard as if measuring the distance from her house to the apple tree. Greed perhaps, or the fear of losing face, enough to warrant suspicion, but alone insufficient to explain the subtle precision of the crime. Next, the gardener admitted to feeling a deep resentment toward Harold for minor slights, a poorly executed hedge, a missing tool, an offhand remark that lingered longer than it should. He spoke with candour, even with a faint smile, yet Miss Marple noted how he hesitated when asked if he had ever been near the orchard after dusk. Small evasions, the detective thought, often pointed to larger secrets. The gardener's motive was personal, driven by anger, but his physical stature and the footprints she had observed suggested he could not have carried out the carefully staged tableau alone. Jealousy, too, wove through the village like a subtle thread. The postman, for all his wiry charm and casual manner, had a long-standing rivalry with Harold over minor promotions at the local Society of Accountants. Every word he spoke now, though polite, carried a hint of competition, a simmering envy that Miss Marple catalogued meticulously. Yet even this could not fully explain the delicate placement of the apple, the teacup, or the folded note, nor the hairpin pointing toward the tree, a detail far beyond petty resentment. Miss Marple spent part of the morning piecing together alibis. The baker claimed he had been baking from sunrise until nearly noon, yet his flour-dusted hands and the faint smudge of soil at his heel suggested he had been elsewhere, possibly at the orchard. Mrs. Enderby insisted she had been in her drawing-room, writing letters to distant friends, but her eyes betrayed a calculation, the ability to create opportunity if necessary. The gardener's claimed solitude in his shed conflicted with the shadowed figure reported near the orchard by the witness, hinting at deception or an accomplice. The postman's daily route, while well documented, included a stretch that passed the orchard in near darkness, an opportunity missed by others but not by someone attuned to timing. The detective began mapping connections, who had interacted with Harold in the days preceding his death, who had knowledge of the orchard, who had access to objects like the delicate teacup or the embroidered handkerchief. Each person's relationship to Harold added a layer of complexity. A neighbour might have been friendly yet secretly envious, a shopkeeper helpful yet resentful, a relative polite yet covetous of inheritance. Miss Marple observed patterns in their speech, the subtle emphasis on words like only, never, and nothing unusual. These were verbal breadcrumbs leading toward hidden truths. Even the child who had crouched near the apple tree days earlier provided insight. Though seemingly innocent, the child had overheard snippets of arguments, mentions of debts, disputes over property, and whispered warnings about revealing secrets. Miss Marple realized that children often remember what adults try to bury, and their observations, though fragmented, could illuminate the motives behind the carefully staged murder. By late afternoon, a tentative web began to take shape in her mind, a lattice of jealousy, fear, greed, and revenge, each strand connecting the villagers in ways both subtle and overt. No single motive explained the entirety of the crime, yet each suspect contributed to the complex design. The apple, the teacup, the note, the hairpin, the mislaid jacket, all seemed designed to point investigators in conflicting directions, forcing them to consider multiple culprits at once. Miss Marple returned to the orchard, walking slowly among the trees, her eyes tracing invisible lines between the houses and the crime scene. The crime was not random, nor purely impulsive. It was a message, a carefully choreographed act meant to mislead, to frighten, to manipulate. And yet she knew that within this labyrinth of motives, the threads could be unravelled with patience and attention. Somewhere within the intricate dance of fear, jealousy, and ambition lay the truth of who had orchestrated Harold Tyndall's death, and why. The following morning brought a flurry of excitement to Maple Hollow. The constable, usually cautious and methodical, appeared almost triumphant as he summoned Miss Marple to the village hall. In the centre of the table lay a small, neatly folded package containing the recovered jacket, soil-stained but now freshly laundered, and a small notebook that had been found tucked beneath the baker's counter during a routine search. The authorities had convinced themselves that the gardener, whose fingerprints had been found on both the jacket and the notebook, was the culprit. They were in his possession all along, the constable declared, voice thick with satisfaction. The gardener had the motive, the opportunity, and now the physical evidence. Case closed. He smiled broadly, turning to the gathered villagers who nodded in relief. Maple Hollow can rest easy. Miss Marple, however, remained silent, examining the jacket with careful scrutiny. The soil on its cuff matched the orchard's earth, yes, but the pattern of its scuffs suggested it had been placed there deliberately. The notebook, too, was misleading. Though the handwriting matched the gardener's, the entries were peculiar, containing mundane observations and coded references to apple harvests, weather patterns, and seemingly innocuous household events. Miss Marple suspected the entries were meant to frame him, to provide a neat narrative for those eager to find closure. The gardener, brought forward and questioned, maintained his innocence with a mixture of anxiety and indignation. "I had the jacket for mending," he explained, wringing his hands. "And the notebook. It's my personal record of garden tasks, that's all." His alibi for the night of Harold Tyndall's death was thin, but Miss Marple noticed a subtle defensiveness that seemed natural, rather than rehearsed. Someone truly guilty often underestimates the ability of observers to detect artifice. Someone framed, however, treads carefully, exaggerating the truth in the wrong places. Yet the constable, buoyed by the apparent breakthrough, ignored these subtleties. Reports were filed, announcements drafted, and within hours the village buzzed with the news that the gardener had been implicated in the murder. Relief mingled with the villagers' lingering unease, and Miss Marple could see the subtle exhalations of tension, the small smiles of neighbours who wanted to believe in a tidy resolution. But Miss Marple could not. She returned to the orchard alone that afternoon, walking slowly along the same paths she had studied for days. The scene had not changed, yet the elements within it, the apple, the teacup fragments, the folded note, and the faint footprints, spoke to her differently now. The placement of objects suggested calculation, precision, a hand unaccustomed to improvisation. The gardener's presence might explain some details, but the orchestration of the tableau seemed beyond his temperament, beyond his knowledge of the subtle signals embedded within the scene. Her gaze drifted to the hairpin, still lying near the edge of the clearing, glinting faintly in the low sun. It had not been mentioned in any report, not noticed by the constable or the villagers, yet it pointed to a deliberate attention to detail, a sophistication that indicated someone who understood not only human behaviour, but also the investigative habits of the authorities. Whoever had orchestrated Harold's death had anticipated how each clue might be interpreted, leaving just enough to mislead and distract. Miss Marple retraced the footsteps in the soft earth. She realized the danger. The real perpetrator remained unseen, confident in the illusion that a false victory had been claimed. They had watched the village celebrate, listened to the constable's announcement, and waited for the moment when curiosity would fade, when suspicion would settle comfortably on the gardener. It was a bold move, relying on the eagerness of others to accept superficial explanations, and it required patience, cunning, and a complete understanding of human tendencies, qualities Miss Marple knew well from years of observing subtle manipulations. Returning home, she reflected on the voices she had heard in the hall, the contradictions in their statements, and the web of motives she had begun to untangle. Each narrative contained fragments of truth, but the gardener's apparent guilt did not align with the orchestration of the orchard scene. The apple, the teacup, the note, the hairpin, all these details demanded a mind more meticulous than his, one capable of controlling not only events but also perception. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, eyes following the branches of the apple tree swaying gently in the breeze. She knew the case was far from solved. The gardener might be implicated in evidence, but the true culprit was still in the shadows, watching, waiting, perhaps even preparing to mislead again. The village had celebrated a premature victory, but the detective's instinct told her the resolution was only an illusion, and that the real danger, and the real truth, remained carefully hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Miss Marple woke early the following morning, her mind restless with the puzzle that refused to settle. The orchard, the staged objects, and the false victory of the gardener's implication had left an uneasy residue in her thoughts. She brewed a cup of tea and reviewed her notes, tracing each line of motive, each fragment of witness testimony, until a pattern, subtle but persistent, began to emerge. Something had been overlooked, not a single clue, but a connection buried in time, a shadow of the past stretching into the present. Her first visit was to the village archives, a dusty room in the corner of the library, where old newspapers, council records and forgotten correspondences were kept. Pulling out a file labelled Maple Hollow Miscellaneous, she leafed through yellowed pages, eyes scanning the small paragraphs that had long since been ignored. Then a name caught her attention, Harold Tyndall. Not the accountant, but another Tyndall nearly 30 years earlier, implicated in a minor dispute over orchard property. The case had been dismissed, seemingly trivial, yet the details, jealousy, secrecy, subtle threats, mirrored aspects of the present tragedy. Miss Marple's fingers traced the faded ink of a witness statement. The elder Tyndall had been accused of hiding evidence to protect a family member, someone named Mrs. Enderby, her name now unmistakably present in today's network of suspects. A chill ran down her spine. The orchard, once the centre of a petty inheritance quarrel, had remained a stage for long festering grudges. Motive, she realized, was not merely rooted in the present, it had been cultivated over decades, intertwined with the ambitions, fears, and resentments of those who had lived in Maple Hollow for generations. Armed with this revelation, she returned to the village, observing the same faces with renewed scrutiny. Mrs. Enderby, of course, had been a child during the earlier dispute, yet old grudges had a habit of simmering quietly. The baker and the postman, whose minor jealousies and resentments had seemed trivial, now appeared as participants in a broader tapestry of long-standing connections. Miss Marple noted the subtle ways they interacted. Hesitant glances, slight inclinations of the head toward one another, small gestures that seemed meaningless until contextualized within decades of shared history. Her attention turned to the orchard itself. The gnarled apple tree, which had witnessed generations of village life, had been more than a backdrop. It had been a silent witness, a repository for memories and conflicts. Miss Marple knelt by the base of the tree and examined the soil. Among the scattered leaves she found the faint imprint of a boot, partially concealed by moss. The shape was unusual, smaller than the gardener's, and its angle suggested careful placement rather than a hasty exit. Someone familiar with the terrain had deliberately traced this path, leaving it as a silent signal, perhaps even as a taunt. Returning to the village hall, she revisited statements from the witnesses, now reading them through the lens of historical context. Mrs. Enderby's seemingly polite reconciliations took on a sharper edge when connected to the orchard dispute decades earlier. The gardener, whose innocence had seemed plausible, had family ties reaching back into the older case, explaining his proximity and familiarity with the orchard. Even the postman's rivalry, trivial at first glance, now appeared as a continuation of inherited resentments and obligations, carried forward subtly in his daily routes and careful observations. Miss Marple realized the crime was not merely about Harold Tyndall's death. It was a carefully staged act that drew upon layers of personal history, hidden alliances, and inherited motives. The apple, the teacup, the note, each was designed not only to mislead the authorities but also to communicate, silently and deliberately, to those who understood the village's long memory. The past had shaped the present, and understanding it was crucial to deciphering the orchestration of the murder. By late afternoon, Miss Marple's mind had formed a preliminary hypothesis. The murderer had exploited generational knowledge, anticipating the constable's procedural habits and the villagers' eagerness for closure. The crime was a message, both immediate and historical, demanding attention to detail, careful listening, and a deep understanding of human nature across time. The shadow of a decades-old feud had finally surfaced, and within it lay the key to uncovering the true culprit, the one who had manipulated not only events but perception, leaving others to stumble over misleading evidence while they watched from the safety of obscurity. Miss Marple stood once more in the orchard, now quiet in the fading light, and gazed at the apple tree. Beneath its branches, amidst the fallen fruit and scattered leaves, she understood that the resolution would require untangling both present deceit and past grievances. The real criminal, hidden within the weave of old motives and current opportunity, remained patient. But Miss Marple, attuned to the whispers of history and human nature alike, was ready to follow the threads wherever they led. Miss Marple spent the evening in quiet contemplation, reviewing her growing mental map of the village, the orchard, and the web of historical grudges and current resentments. By the flickering light of her study lamp, she realized that traditional questioning had reached its limits. The gardener had been falsely implicated, the witnesses had lied or withheld details, and even the villagers' own statements were tangled in layers of old grievances. What she needed was a way to provoke a reaction, to test the suspects in a manner that would bypass rehearsed stories and reveal instinctive truth. The following morning she returned to the village hall under the pretense of assisting the constable with inventorying the collected evidence. The suspects were gathered, including Mrs. Enderby, the postman, and the baker, who each presented themselves with a mixture of politeness and guarded curiosity. Miss Marple carried with her a small, nondescript wooden box, claiming it contained personal items belonging to Harold Tyndall recovered from the orchard. The box, she said, had not been examined fully, and she proposed a demonstration to determine which objects might have been handled recently, an idea that seemed mundane enough to escape suspicion, yet contained a subtle psychological purpose. She placed the box on the table and invited each suspect to examine its contents one at a time, under the guise of assisting in cataloguing evidence. The objects were ordinary: a coin, a piece of twine, a pen, a folded scrap of paper that matched the one found under Harold's shoe, and a fragment of the broken teacup. The trick was simple yet clever. Miss Marple had dusted the items lightly with flour overnight, leaving faint traces that would cling to fingers when handled. The intention was not forensic per se, but observational. She would note which suspect exhibited discomfort, hesitation, or subtle attempts to avoid contact, gestures that often revealed concealed knowledge or guilt. The baker went first, handling the objects gingerly, occasionally adjusting his grip, but nothing seemed unusual. He smiled too often, trying to appear eager and cooperative. The postman followed, moving the items with deliberate care, but his hand brushed against the flour, leaving a faint smudge along the edge of the table. He barely noticed, or pretended not to. When it was Mrs. Enderby's turn, Miss Marple observed her closely. At first she appeared composed, examining the coin and twine with careful attention. But when her fingers approached the folded scrap of paper, the very one inscribed with the word "Listen," her hand froze for a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then she quickly lifted it and laid it down again with exaggerated care. Her eyes, previously composed, flickered toward Miss Marple, a subtle tightening around her lips betraying discomfort. The reaction was slight, almost imperceptible, yet it carried meaning. Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Enderby had either recognized the paper or understood its significance in a way the others did not. The deliberate hesitation, the almost imperceptible flinch, revealed a crack in her composed demeanor, a reaction impossible to fabricate convincingly under the pressure of instinct. By allowing the suspects to interact with the objects in a controlled yet psychologically revealing way, Miss Marple had bypassed rehearsed statements, exposing an unconscious response that spoke louder than words. After the demonstration, she left the hall, walking slowly toward the orchard, letting the subtle disturbance she had observed simmer in her mind. The flour-smudged hands were irrelevant to law, but the instinctive reaction was everything. It indicated knowledge, involvement, or at the very least a connection to the orchestration of the crime. Miss Marple understood that the real culprit was not the gardener, nor someone acting out of simple greed or envy, but someone capable of planning meticulously, manipulating the evidence and, crucially, responding instinctively when confronted with a subtle trigger. The orchard seemed quieter than ever that afternoon, yet alive with suggestion. Every element she had observed, the apple, the teacup, the note, the misplaced hairpin, had been placed with intent. The flower exercise had revealed that someone, long connected to the village and its hidden histories, could not entirely suppress a reaction. The psychological test had been unconventional, but it had produced exactly what she needed, a glimpse of truth emerging from the carefully constructed illusions. Miss Marple understood that the investigation was entering its decisive phase. The web of motives, the shadows of the past, and now the subtle crack in Mrs. Enderby's composure, all pointed toward a careful, calculating mind behind Harold Tyndall's death. The challenge was no longer simply to collect evidence. It was to interpret human behavior with precision, to follow the threads of instinct, and to reveal the person who had orchestrated an intricate crime that had misled everyone else. And she knew, with a quiet certainty, that the next move would require patience, cunning, and a final careful unravelling of the deception waiting in the shadows. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Miss Marple returned to the village hall to review the evidence one more time. The table, usually neat and orderly, was now scattered with items collected from the orchard, the broken teacup fragments, the folded scrap of paper, the hairpin, and the soil-stained jacket. She carefully lifted each piece, examining angles, textures, and markings with the same meticulous attention that had guided her throughout the investigation. Every object carried meaning, a message left by someone clever enough to anticipate the authorities' limitations. The constable entered, breathless and pale. "Miss Marple, you need to see this," he said, glancing around nervously. He led her to the evidence cupboard. When he opened it, her heart sank. The folded scrap of paper, the very note marked "Listen," was gone. Every other item remained, but that single crucial piece of evidence had vanished without a trace. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The paper had been central to her observations, the psychological trigger in the flower exercise, a subtle linchpin connecting past motives to present actions. Its disappearance was no accident. Someone had deliberately removed it, knowing its significance and seeking to disrupt the investigation. She turned slowly to the constable. "This was no ordinary theft," she said softly. "Someone understands this case as well as, or perhaps better than, we do. They are not merely hiding, they are manipulating." The hall grew tense as the villagers realized what had occurred. Whispers and accusations fluttered like startled birds, yet Miss Marple remained calm, observing faces, postures, and gestures with keen precision. One by one, she noted who seemed anxious, who seemed too eager to insist on their innocence, and who subtly avoided her gaze. The vanishing evidence had introduced fear into the village, and fear often revealed more than words ever could. She recalled the flower exercise from earlier, particularly Mrs. Enderby's subtle hesitation when handling the note. If anyone had motive and knowledge to remove it, she was at the top of the list. Miss Marple considered the possibilities. Had Mrs. Enderby acted alone, or had an accomplice assisted? The gardener, previously framed, remained under scrutiny, yet there was no indication he had the cunning to execute such a precise act. The postman, too, moved with quiet, deliberate attention to detail, capable of observation, yet none of the physical evidence suggested he had handled the note recently. Miss Marple decided it was time to probe the village indirectly. She sent for those closest to the orchard under the guise of verifying alibis, observing reactions as she mentioned the missing note casually, watching for instinctive flinches or defensiveness. The baker, who had handled the box the day before, spoke with exaggerated concern, repeatedly emphasizing that he had never touched the note directly. His insistence, she noted, was carefully constructed, yet the micro-adjustments of his fingers, the slight shift of his body away from her gaze, suggested an underlying tension. Meanwhile, she considered the orchard itself. The note had likely been removed before anyone could observe, taken from the scene or perhaps even from the evidence table itself. This meant the perpetrator had not only anticipated her tactics but had acted quickly, moving with a precision that indicated forethought. They were working against her, attempting to bury the truth before she could connect the psychological, historical, and material threads she had so painstakingly gathered. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Mrs. Enderby. The subtle crack in her composure during the flower exercise now seemed more significant, more intentional. The disappearance of the note was not merely a protective act, it was a signal, a manipulation intended to misdirect attention and sow doubt. Whoever had taken it was confident in their ability to anticipate each step of the investigation, counting on the constable's eagerness to declare resolution and the villagers' readiness to accept it. By nightfall, Miss Marple had retreated to her cottage, eyes tracing the shadows cast by the lamp onto the walls lined with herbs and books. The stakes had risen sharply, trust had become fragile, the simplest interactions tinged with suspicion. The vanishing evidence proved that the criminal remained active, alert, and calculating. And though the case had progressed, through historical context, psychological insight, and observation, the removal of the note reminded her that the final truth was still carefully guarded, hidden within the mind and intent of someone determined to stay ahead. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, her gaze drifting to the orchard in the distance, now cloaked in moonlight. The criminal was watching, waiting, ensuring that any false step might mislead or stall the investigation, but she was patient as the mist that lingered over the apple trees. Whoever had taken the note had underestimated one thing: Miss Marple's ability to see the invisible, to trace the unseen connections, and to listen for the whispers of truth, even when the most crucial evidence had vanished. The village was unusually still the next morning, the usual hum of life in Maple Hollow, subdued by anxiety and unease. Miss Marple, walking toward the orchard to revisit the scene under the soft glow of dawn, sensed immediately that something had shifted. The air was heavy, damp with mist, carrying a tension that pressed against her chest. Something had changed overnight, though she could not yet place what. As she approached the apple tree, her eyes fell upon a sight that made her heart skip a beat. The gardener's shed, normally locked and quiet, had been forced open. The door hung crooked on its hinges, splintered where a crowbar had been used. Tools were scattered across the ground, the faint imprint of hurried footsteps pressed into the soft soil. And then she saw it, a trail of blood, not large but distinct, leading away from the shed toward the village path. Miss Marple followed the trail cautiously, noting the signs of a struggle, a displaced stone here, a torn branch there. Her mind raced. The criminal had escalated, moving beyond mere deception and manipulation of evidence to a bold act of intimidation, possibly even another attack. The first murder had been staged, meticulous and controlled. This was different, urgent and dangerous. Whoever was behind. Harold Tyndall's death was no longer content to remain hidden. They were asserting dominance, proving they were several steps ahead. She rounded the corner of the path and nearly stumbled over a body. It was the baker, sprawled across the lane, eyes wide in shock, his apron soaked in blood from a gash along his temple. Someone had attacked him, leaving him for discovery but not entirely concealed. The scene was brutal in contrast to Harold's carefully orchestrated death. Miss Marple knelt beside him, noting the precise angle of the blow, the absence of defensive wounds, and the way his hands were clenched tightly. The attack had been sudden, deliberate, and intended to send a message. The constable arrived moments later, summoned by a passing villager who had found the baker. His face was pale, and for once he seemed at a loss. Miss Marple explained calmly yet firmly that the baker's assault was connected directly to the first murder. The pattern of intimidation, the precision of the act, and the symbolic escalation all pointed to a single calculating mind at work. Whoever had removed the note had now become emboldened, and the stakes had risen dramatically. Miss Marple studied the scene carefully, retracing the steps of the attacker. The footprints were lighter than those found near Harold's body, suggesting smaller, quicker movements. They led away from the village toward a narrow, little-used path along the edge of the orchard, a route that would allow someone to disappear without being seen. The flower exercise, the vanishing note, all of it now pointed toward a villain who understood both human behavior and investigative procedure, someone willing to escalate as necessary to maintain control. Her attention returned to the gardener's shed. Among the scattered tools, Miss Marple spotted something curious, a hairpin identical to the one found at Harold's scene, lying as if dropped carelessly. But unlike before, it was smeared with faint traces of blood, an unusual pattern, as though the attacker had been careless or rushed. This small detail suggested urgency, impatience, and a risk that the villain would make further mistakes if pressed. Miss Marple knew immediately that the investigation had entered a critical phase. This was no longer simply a matter of reconstructing the first murder or interpreting motives and past grudges. Now the criminal was active in real time, capable of violence and aware of every step taken by those attempting to solve the case. Protecting the villagers, anticipating the next move, and preventing another tragedy would require all of her observational skill, historical knowledge, and understanding of human behavior. Returning to the village, she convened the constable privately, outlining a cautious plan, observation, careful monitoring of suspects, and using subtle psychological triggers to draw reactions without revealing their awareness. Every person who had contact with the orchard or the key evidence was now under scrutiny, not for interrogation alone, but for patterns, gestures, and unconscious behavior that might betray their knowledge or involvement. As dusk settled over Maple Hollow, Miss Marple walked alone along the orchard path, her eyes tracing shadows among the apple trees. The criminal had demonstrated boldness, intelligence, and a willingness to escalate, yet Miss Marple, attuned to the faintest cues, had already begun to anticipate the next move. The investigation was no longer a matter of solving a past crime. It had become a race against time, where the safety of the village and the unveiling of the truth depended on her ability to see the invisible and listen for whispers that others could not hear. Miss Marple returned to her cottage that evening, her mind a whirl of possibilities. The attack on the baker had shaken the village, and the disappearance of the note still gnawed at her, but she sensed that the chaos was beginning to reveal its own logic. She spread her notes across the table, sketches of footprints, fragments of the teacup, the locations of the hairpins, witness statements, and her meticulous observations of gestures and micro-expressions. Each detail, considered alone, had seemed minor, almost trivial, but now they began to coalesce into a pattern. Her eyes lingered on the hairpins. One had been found at Harold's death site, the other smeared with blood near the gardener's shed. Both had been carefully placed, yet their positions were not random. They marked a line, an invisible path connecting key locations: the orchard, the shed, the village hall. The placement suggested movement and timing, almost as if the criminal had been tracing a narrative in miniature, a story only someone watching closely could read. Miss Marple realized that the hairpins were not merely evidence, they were signals, subtle markers left to mislead observers while simultaneously creating a predictable structure for anyone attuned to detail. Then she thought of Mrs. Enderby's hesitation during the flower exercise. It had been so slight, barely noticeable, but in the context of these markers, it made sense. Her instinctive reaction to the note was not merely fear, it was recognition. She knew the meaning embedded in these small objects, understood the choreography that had guided the placement of each clue, and likely anticipated the authorities' misinterpretation. The criminal was someone who relied on subtlety, on the smallest elements of human observation, and had used them to control the investigation from behind the scenes. Miss Marple revisited the witnesses' statements, reading them with the pattern in mind. The baker's insistence on never touching the note, his exaggerated politeness, suddenly aligned with the rhythm of the crime. He had been confronted by the perpetrator, threatened subtly, or perhaps even complicit in ways designed to obscure. The postman's overly cautious handling of objects, the gardener's routine familiarity with the orchard, the lingering tension in Mrs. Enderby's gaze, all of it fit into a sequence that suggested a single guiding mind orchestrating events like a conductor with an unseen orchestra. The folded scrap of paper, though missing, became clearer in its purpose. The word "listen" was not only a warning to Harold, it was a directive to the observers of the crime. Each misplaced object, each subtle clue had been designed to guide attention, provoke reactions, and mislead those who approached too simplistically. Miss Marple understood now that the criminal had exploited the villagers' assumptions, relying on predictable behavior to create a false sense of understanding while keeping the truth just out of reach. Her attention turned to the orchard again. The footprints, the positions of the fallen fruit, the angle of the tree branches, and the slight indentation in the soil where the hairpins had been planted. Each element formed a consistent pattern. It was almost as though the orchard itself had been treated as a giant board for a game, each piece deliberately placed to convey meaning to those who could interpret it. And Miss Marple, attentive to both human nature and minute details, could read it. She realized the breakthrough had been in plain sight all along. The small, seemingly insignificant objects, the hairpins, the teacup fragments, the folded note, had been designed to manipulate perception. The criminals had relied on others' failure to notice these microsignals, confident that their plan would remain invisible. But Miss Marple saw it. She traced the invisible line connecting the crime scenes, the gestures of the villagers, and the historical grudges that had simmered in Maple Hollow for decades. The sequence of events, once chaotic and disjointed, now revealed a precise logic. The killer's pattern was clear, deliberate, and audacious. Sitting back, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The pieces of the puzzle had been hidden in the ordinary, in a glance, a gesture, a misplaced object. The pattern was no longer abstract, it was tangible, readable, and, most importantly, actionable. The final stage of the investigation would not require force or confrontation alone, but a careful application of observation and deduction, following the pattern laid out by the perpetrator, to expose the mind that had orchestrated Harold Tyndall's death, the baker's attack, and the vanishing note. Miss Marple stood and gazed out her window at the orchard, now bathed in moonlight. Every shadow, every branch, every fallen apple seemed to carry a message waiting to be interpreted. She knew she had found the key. The pattern, subtle yet unmistakable, had been hidden in plain sight, and it would lead her directly to the criminal. Miss Marple awoke early the following morning with a quiet sense of purpose. The pattern of the crime, now fully visible in her mind, pointed toward a motive far more intricate than any mere quarrel over land, petty envy, or inheritance. She had spent the night tracing connections, reviewing witness reactions, and replaying the flower exercise in her mind, and at last, the underlying force driving the events of Maple Hollow began to reveal itself. Her first stop was Mrs. Enderby's house. She arrived unannounced, a deliberate choice. She wanted to observe the woman's unguarded behavior, free from pretense or expectation. Mrs. Enderby greeted her politely, smiling as if nothing had occurred. But Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the subtle tension in her posture, the way her hands rested tightly on the arm of the chair, the minute flinch when the detective mentioned the orchard. She offered tea, and Mrs. Enderby accepted, her movements precise, measured. As they spoke, Miss Marple steered the conversation subtly toward Harold Tyndall, the orchard, and the vanished note. At first, Mrs. Enderby responded with carefully neutral statements, insisting that Harold had been difficult but never threatening, that the gardener and the baker were loyal and harmless, and that the village had always been a quiet, orderly place. Miss Marple nodded politely, making mental notes of gestures and hesitation, then allowed a pregnant pause to settle between them. It was that pause which changed everything. Mrs. Enderby's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands tightening into fists for a moment before she forced them open again. A single, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips, but it carried the weight of long repressed emotion. "You don't understand," she said quietly, voice trembling. "It wasn't just about Harold, or the orchard, or money. It was never that simple." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but deliberate. "Then tell me, Mrs. Enderby, what truly drove you?" The older woman's eyes flickered to the window, toward the orchard, and a shadow passed over her features. "Fear," she whispered. "Not of Harold, not really. It was the fear of being forgotten, of having my life and my family's history erased. That orchard, that tree, it was all that connected me to who I am. And when I saw Harold interfering, manipulating, I knew he would destroy it all, and if he could, he would erase everything my family had built. I had to stop him. I had to make him listen." Miss Marple listened, her expression calm but her mind racing. The note, the carefully staged evidence, the psychological games, it was all part of a desperate attempt to impose control over a past that Mrs. Enderby feared losing. This was not mere greed or revenge. It was a profoundly personal, almost obsessive need to preserve identity and legacy. Harold Tyndall's death had been orchestrated not for money, but to protect a fragile sense of self, a history that she believed was under threat. The detective noticed now the subtle ways in which Mrs. Enderby had manipulated others, the baker, the gardener, even the postman. Their actions had been coerced or influenced through implication, fear, and the deliberate construction of misdirection. She had created a network of small, interconnected deceptions, each designed to protect her secret while allowing others to take the blame, or at least to mislead the authorities. Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. "You see," she said gently, "the orchard and your family's history have been your lifeline, but they cannot justify harming others. Fear has led you to dangerous extremes, but it also reveals the depth of your attachment. It is an understandable, though misguided, motive." Mrs. Enderby's face crumpled, the first true sign of vulnerability Miss Marple had witnessed. I never wanted anyone else hurt," she admitted, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. "I only wanted to protect what was mine, what belonged to me, what connected me to the past." Miss Marple nodded, understanding the human complexity beneath the actions. The crime was a convergence of obsession, fear, and historical grievance, executed with precision and psychological insight. The missing note, the hairpins, the staged objects, even the attack on the baker, they were all components of a plan designed to preserve control, maintain secrecy, and manipulate perception. The hidden motive was clear. It was not money, revenge, or envy alone, but a desperate desire to safeguard identity and legacy, a fear of erasure so powerful that it had driven a respectable villager to orchestrate murder. By mid-afternoon, the full picture had crystallized in Miss Marple's mind. The crime had roots that stretched deep into the past, threaded through family history, personal insecurities, and decades of unspoken resentment. The orchestrator had acted out of fear, yet wielded intelligence and meticulous planning to ensure success, misdirection, and near-perfect concealment. The hidden motive, far more shocking than any material gain, explained not only the first murder but the subsequent attacks and vanishing evidence. And now, understanding it, Miss Marple was ready to confront the orchestrator, not only to bring justice, but to untangle the intricate web of human fears that had ensnared Maple Hollow. Miss Marple spent the evening planning carefully. She knew the full extent of Mrs. Enderby's motives now, and she understood the meticulous way the woman had orchestrated the murder, manipulated the villagers, and concealed evidence. There was no room for error. Any misstep could allow the perpetrator to disappear again, or worse, cause another tragedy. She decided on a direct approach, one that would leave the villain little opportunity to maneuver while allowing the truth to reveal itself naturally. By nightfall, Miss Marple had arranged for the constable to gather the primary suspects at the village hall under the pretense of reviewing remaining evidence from the orchard. The hall was quiet, the air tense, punctuated only by the creak of floorboards and the occasional rustle of clothing. Mrs. Enderby arrived last, her composure impeccable, yet her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. She smiled politely at the villagers, masking her tension, unaware that Miss Marple had anticipated every gesture, every instinctive reaction she might attempt. Miss Marple addressed the group calmly, her voice soft but carrying authority. "We've spent many days observing the orchard, the evidence, and each other," she said. "But patterns like footprints in the soil rarely lie. Every object, every gesture, every hesitation has a meaning, and I believe we have finally come to understand why Harold Tyndall's death occurred." Mrs. Enderby's eyes darted subtly to the orchard, to the fragments of teacup displayed on the table, and finally to the invisible trail that Miss Marple had traced in her mind. Miss Marple continued, speaking in gentle, deliberate tones. The hairpins, the folded note, the subtle placements of objects, they were not random. They were signals. Signals meant to mislead, to manipulate perception, and to protect someone deeply concerned with preserving identity, history, and legacy. A faint tremor passed through Mrs. Enderby, but she maintained her composure, nodding politely. Miss Marple paused, letting the silence stretch, feeling the tension thicken in the room. She then spoke with the precision of someone who had traced the invisible lines of human behavior. "We have all seen small deceptions, minor misdirections, and gestures that seemed meaningless, but when viewed together, they reveal a deliberate orchestration, a mind determined to control not only events, but also our understanding of them." Mrs. Enderby's hands gripped her lap for a fraction of a second too long, and Miss Marple seized the opportunity. "Mrs. Enderby," she said quietly, leaning forward, "you have acted to protect something that mattered more than money or simple quarrel. You feared erasure, the loss of history, and the destruction of what you hold dear, and in that fear you guided actions that led to Harold Tyndall's death, the attack on the baker, and the disappearance of the note." For a moment the room was still, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock. Then Mrs. Enderby exhaled sharply, as though a weight had been lifted, or perhaps broken. Her eyes filled with tears, and her composure faltered. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling, I never wanted anyone hurt beyond what was necessary. I only wanted to make him listen." Her voice cracked, and she lowered her head. Miss Marple observed her carefully, noting the subtle signs of guilt and relief. She had seen enough: the psychological manipulation, the careful planning, the historical obsession. It all aligned perfectly. The villager who had appeared calm, polite, and rational had been the mastermind all along, and now, under the careful pressure of observation and logic, the facade had cracked. The constable stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Mrs. Enderby's arm, guiding her toward the acknowledgement of her actions without resistance. She allowed herself to be led, murmuring explanations and justifications, the weight of decades of fear and obsession spilling into confession. The other villagers watched in silence, realization dawning slowly that the chaos that had gripped Maple Hollow had originated, not from random malice, but from a carefully concealed fear of loss. Miss Marple remained composed, her calm presence anchoring the room. The case, tangled in historical grievances, psychological manipulation, and meticulous planning, had finally found its resolution. The orchard, once a silent witness to mystery and deceit, now stood as a symbol of truth revealed, its secrets laid bare by observation, deduction, and a patient understanding of human nature. As the constable guided Mrs. Enderby away, Miss Marple glanced toward the moonlit orchard, noting the subtle alignment of branches and shadows, the places where clues had been planted, and the faintest traces of footprints still lingering in the soft soil. Everything had fallen into place. The pattern had been discerned, the motive revealed, and the orchestrator confronted. Maple Hollow would breathe easier now, though its memory of events would forever carry the lesson that fear and obsession could drive even the most respectable among them to extremes, and that truth, however carefully concealed, could always be discerned by those patient enough to observe. The village had settled into a tentative calm by the following morning. Mrs. Enderby had been taken into custody, and the constable had begun cataloguing the confessions and tying up the threads of the case. The orchard, once the stage for deception and fear, now seemed tranquil under the early light, the apple trees standing silently, their branches swaying in the breeze as though exhaling relief. Miss Marple, however, remained uneasy. The pattern was complete, the motive revealed, but something still tugged at the edges of her mind, a detail too small to notice yet persistent enough to demand attention. She returned to the orchard alone, retracing the paths, examining the precise angles of footprints, and observing the positions where the hairpins and fragments of the teacup had lain. Her gaze fell on the soil beneath the main apple tree. At first it seemed unchanged, but then she noticed an indentation that had escaped earlier scrutiny, a shallow mark, almost imperceptible, that suggested a weight had rested there temporarily. It was small, easily dismissed, but in her experience, the smallest details often held the most significance. Her thoughts returned to the villagers' statements, the flower exercise, and the timing of events. If Mrs. Enderby had orchestrated the murder, the attack on the baker, and the disappearance of the note, she had done so with meticulous planning. Yet someone had been close enough to manipulate the evidence in real time. Someone who might have guided or even corrected her actions without drawing notice. A thought struck Miss Marple sharply. What if the confession, carefully extracted and fully believed by everyone, was part of a second layer of misdirection? She returned to the village hall, reviewing the statements once more, when a single offhand remark caught her attention. The constable had mentioned, almost casually, that while the evidence had been gathered, the notebook found beneath the baker's counter had a page torn out. She had noted it before, but dismissed it, assuming it irrelevant. Now, in the context of the indentation under the tree and Mrs. Enderby's meticulous manipulation, it clicked. The torn page could only have been removed by someone with both intimate knowledge of the orchard and access to the evidence after the crime had occurred. Her mind raced, tracing connections. The gardener, previously framed, had been in proximity to all key locations, and his routine movements in the orchard would have allowed him to notice Mrs. Enderby's manipulations. But he lacked the cunning to orchestrate the murders or the psychological sophistication to plan the misdirection. Then her attention returned to the postman, quiet, observant, always nearby, often overlooked. He had been in the orchard at odd hours, familiar with the paths, and had opportunities to handle the evidence subtly. His gestures, always measured and cautious, had appeared inconsequential, but perhaps they had been deliberate, guiding events from the shadows while Mrs. Enderby took the fall. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she pieced it together. The postman had acted as the true mastermind, exploiting Mrs. Enderby's fear and obsession to shape her into an unwitting accomplice. She had supplied the motive, executed some steps, and reacted predictably under observation. But every crucial piece, from the removal of the note to the attack on the baker, bore the subtle mark of someone operating behind the scenes. The flower exercise, the missing note, the psychological triggers, they had all been anticipated by someone else entirely. Someone whose understanding of the village's routines and personalities allowed them to orchestrate events without suspicion. Miss Marple walked quickly toward the postman's residence, noting how ordinary everything appeared, the neatly stacked mail, the quiet streets, the faint scent of ink and paper from his bag. She entered politely, asking about mundane deliveries, her voice light and conversational, while her mind scanned the room. Then, near the desk, she saw it, a page torn from the notebook, hidden beneath a stack of correspondence, bearing the same coded notes Mrs. Enderby had mimicked. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, and intentional. The postman appeared behind her, startled, then quickly composed, masking surprise with forced calm. "Miss Marple," he said smoothly, "I thought everything had been resolved. Is there something amiss?" She turned, her gaze steady, and held up the torn page. "It seems we were too quick to celebrate, my friend. Someone has been guiding events from the shadows. It appears the true orchestration lies not with the confessed, but with the one who could remain unseen while allowing others to play their roles. His smile faltered, a micro-expression of panic flashing across his features. Miss Marple's calm presence filled the room as she observed him carefully. The tension, the hesitation, the subtle adjustments of his hands betrayed what he hoped to conceal. The final twist, the hidden architect of chaos, had revealed himself not through arrogance or confession, but through instinctive reaction under observation. Miss Marple allowed the silence to settle, knowing that, as always, truth emerged most clearly when one did not rush it. Most move belonged to her now. Unravel the final layer of deception, confront the true mastermind, and bring the orchestrator into the light. Maple Hollow, for all its history, secrets and fear, would finally have closure, but not until this last, unexpected twist was fully confronted. Miss Marple stood quietly, allowing the postman to absorb the weight of her words. The torn page in her hand was more than evidence. It was a map of his manipulations, a record of how he had orchestrated the sequence of events, while hiding behind Mrs. Enderby's fear and obsession. She spoke gently, almost conversationally, yet each word was precise, exposing layers of deception that had gone unnoticed by the constable and the villagers. "You see," she began, the note that disappeared, the attack on the baker, even the small flower exercise, each was designed to elicit reactions, but someone anticipated every movement. The note vanished not by chance, but by the hand of someone who understood how others would interpret it. The hairpins were placed to mislead, yet in their positioning lay a subtle rhythm, a pattern only observable to one who watched both people and procedure alike. And that pattern pointed to you. The postman's calm mask cracked imperceptibly. His hands, previously folded neatly, twitched slightly. Miss Marple's eyes followed the motion with clinical precision. "You allowed Mrs. Enderby to act, knowing her fear and attachment would drive her to make choices that appeared independent. You created the facade of motive while pulling strings from behind the curtain. Every step, every micro-reaction, every misdirection, it was guided by your hand. Yet in your care, a single mistake betrayed you, the indentation under the apple tree. Only someone who had been present, moving deliberately, and familiar with the minutiae of this orchard could have left it there. Only someone capable of reading both human instinct and environment with the same eye as myself could have executed such precise misdirection." He swallowed hard, the faintest tremor in his lips betraying what he had hoped to conceal. I did not intend for it to go so far," he murmured, his voice wavering between denial and justification. "I only wanted to protect the village from chaos, from losing its past." Miss Marple shook her head slightly, a mixture of pity and resolve in her expression. "You manipulated fear and attachment, exploiting Mrs. Enderby's deep-rooted insecurities. The orchard, the tree, the family histories, these were your tools. Harold Tyndall's death, the baker's injury, the note that vanished, all were consequences of your need for control, a need that overrode morality and human life. Yet even in your cleverness you overlooked the consistency of observation, the invisible threads that connect motive, opportunity, and behavior. Those threads have led me to you." The postman's shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him as he realized the extent of Miss Marple's insight. But then, in a sudden calculated motion, he moved toward the window, as though escape might still be possible. Miss Marple did not flinch. Her gaze was steady, anticipating each instinctive move. "There is no need for further action," she said softly. "Justice is not measured by panic or flight, but by recognition of the truth. You cannot outrun the pattern you created, nor the careful attention that has revealed it." For a heartbeat, he hesitated, weighing the choice between flight and surrender. The precision of her observation left him trapped, the invisible net of evidence and insight closing in. Finally he nodded, a reluctant acknowledgement of defeat, and allowed the constable, who had arrived quietly behind Miss Marple, to step forward and place him under custody. Miss Marple turned to the constable, her expression serene yet unwavering. "Notice," she said, pointing to the indentation under the apple tree, the smudges of flour on previously handled objects, and the subtle asymmetry in the placement of the hairpins, how these minute details, overlooked by so many, formed the breadcrumbs that revealed the true architect. Observation, patience, and understanding human behavior, not haste, uncovered what others missed. It is often the smallest, seemingly trivial elements that betray the greatest deception. The villagers who had gathered outside the hall watched silently as the postman was led away. Relief mingled with lingering unease. Maple Hollow had justice, yet the subtle complexity of the crimes left an indelible impression. Miss Marple knew that, although the perpetrator had been captured, the echoes of fear, obsession, and manipulation would remain in the collective memory of the village. She lingered near the orchard one last time, gazing at the apple trees whose branches had borne witness to deceit, fear, and revelation. Everything was now accounted for, the pattern discerned, the motives exposed, the manipulations unmasked, but the quiet knowledge remained. Human nature, with its fears, obsessions, and cleverness, could always produce surprises. Justice had been served, yet the shadows of intent and the subtle traces of deception left behind a lingering awareness that vigilance, patience, and insight were indispensable to truly understanding the stories hidden beneath ordinary appearances. Miss Marple, turning toward her cottage, felt the familiar satisfaction of a case fully unravelled, and yet, in the silence of the orchard, she sensed the subtle truth that even the most intricate plans, once revealed, could leave questions behind, whispers of motive and method that reminded all who observed that human cunning, while eventually exposed, could never be entirely predictable. The village seemed to exhale at last, the tension that had gripped every street and household easing with the capture of the postman and the confession of Mrs. Enderby. Maple Hollow was quiet once more, the orchard's branches casting soft, swaying shadows in the late afternoon sun. Villagers moved carefully, some avoiding the eye of neighbours who had been caught in fear or manipulation, while others spoke in hushed tones of the extraordinary unravelling of events. Miss Marple walked slowly along the familiar paths, her eyes sweeping the orchard, noting the small indentations in the soil and the subtle curve of a fallen branch. Everything had been accounted for, almost. As she reached the base of the central apple tree, her gaze fell upon something she had not noticed before, a tiny folded scrap of paper, wedged delicately between two roots, partially hidden under moss and soil. Her heart quickened. It was small, easily overlooked, a minor detail, almost incidental, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that the smallest objects often carried the greatest meaning. She bent down, picked it up carefully, and unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, almost scholarly, and it contained only a single word, observe. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind already turning the word over. It was not a threat, nor a clue directly connected to the recent murders, but it suggested observation, attention, and perhaps another layer of human cunning. Someone had left this note deliberately, knowing that an observant eye might eventually find it, even after the major mystery had concluded. The orchard, which had witnessed deception, obsession, and danger, now held another whisper of intrigue, a hint that the human dramas of Maple Hollow were far from fully resolved. She pocketed the scrap of paper and continued her walk toward the village. The streets were calm, yet the air carried a residual tension, the kind that lingered long after crises ended. Villagers passed her with nods and cautious smiles, but she could sense their unease. They had glimpsed the extraordinary reach of human cunning, the way fear, obsession, and intellect could intertwine to create a web almost impossible to untangle. Yet Miss Marple knew that the greatest lessons of such cases were rarely about the events themselves, but about the enduring complexity of human nature, and the subtle traces left behind even when justice seemed served. Arriving at her cottage, she placed the note on her desk alongside the collected objects from the orchard, the hairpins, fragments of the teacup, and the flower-marked objects that had revealed so much. Even now, after every confession, every revelation, the evidence seemed to hum with meaning, hinting at unspoken truths and possibilities. Her mind traced the sequence of events once more, connecting human motives, minute gestures, and the careful orchestration of fear and deception. And yet, in that quiet reflection, she realized that the mystery never truly ends. Human cleverness adapts, secrets persist, and even in victory, questions remain. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea, gazing out the window at the orchard bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The trees whispered in the wind, carrying with them the faintest echoes of past deception and perhaps the prelude to future intrigue. She felt the familiar thrill of awareness, the subtle certainty that, no matter how complete a resolution appeared, the world contained puzzles waiting patiently to be discovered. The note in her pocket was proof of that, an unclaimed signal, an invitation to observe, and a reminder that human nature rarely presents its truths without nuance. As night fell, the lights of Maple Hollow twinkled softly, peaceful yet fragile, and Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire. She knew that the orchard, the village, and the people within it would rest for now, but the final lingering whisper, the cryptic invitation to observe, reminded her that another layer of the story was waiting, patient and silent. The case of Harold Tyndall, the baker, Mrs. Enderby, and the postman had concluded, yet the subtle hint in the shadows suggested that the mysteries of human behaviour never truly ended. Miss Marple sipped her tea and smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting both satisfaction and curiosity. The village was safe, the criminals exposed, yet the world was full of whispers, patterns, and hidden motives that only the most attentive could discern. Somewhere, perhaps nearby, another story was waiting to unfold, another subtle clue, another deception, another test of patience and observation. And Miss Marple, ever watchful, knew she would be ready.